biotechnology is unlocking just extraordinary potential, even beyond the kinds of things that we're doing at Checkerspot. But the measure of the impact, the measure of what that means to consumers and to the day-to-day lives of people worldwide is really measured not in the technology itself, but what it does, how it impacts the products that we use.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Biomarket Insights TV. My name is Paul MacDonald and I'm delighted today to be joined by Charles Dimmler. Charles is the co-founder and CEO of Checkerspot, a material science company based out of California. Hi Charles, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you, Paul?
Yeah, I'm very well. What's the weather like in California today?
Today, it's beautiful. It's actually not as smoky as it has been over the last week, which is a big relief. Sun shining. It's a beautiful day.
Good to hear. So Charles, listen, today's episode is entitled Performance versus Sustainability is a False Choice. Okay, and our viewers are going to be really interested in the Checkerspot story, the creation of innovative biomaterials, the role of the consumer in the bio-NPD process, and of course your thoughts on the transition from petroleum-based materials to bio-based materials, and just some of the things that we're gonna try and cover. So before we get into the guts of the interview, it'd be great if you could tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and what motivated you to transition from the corporate finance sector to the biotech sector and ultimately launch Checkerspot in 2016.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're going way back. So I'm originally from California. I was born in California, but I grew up on the East Coast outside of New York. And I happened to grow up in a place that was located right next to the old Bell Laboratories, which is only important in the context of sharing a little bit of background because the high school, which was a public high school that I went to, had a lot of kids that had parents who were physicists and mathematicians at Bell Laboratories. And so there was a very heavy science and math focus in my high school. And I loved it. And I felt like that was an area that I really wanted to sort of build a career around. So when I went off to college, if you're interested in math and science, one of the places to potentially focus is medicine. And I was pre-med in college, but I went to a school that had a core curriculum and kind of opened my eyes to the humanities and to things like philosophy, and ultimately decided to major not in science, but in history. But yet went through the entire pre-med curriculum. And that's important because it was in that experience of doing something other than science that I was introduced to the world of economics and business. And ultimately, even though I finished the pre-med curriculum and took my MCATs and had bench experience and was excited about the prospect of engaging in the healthcare system, I elected not to go to medical school and instead went for what I thought would be 1 or 2 years on Wall Street, and ended up spending a little more than 3 years as an investment banker, a junior investment banker, back in the mid 90s. And that definitely changed the course of my career. Was sure that I didn't want to go to medical school and be a practicing physician, but really wanted to be at the intersection between the life sciences and business. And to kind of round out your question, I decided to make the transition from finance to biotechnology because most of the transactions that I was working on as a banker were life science and healthcare focused, but I wanted to be a part of building those companies and not just executing transactions. I always felt this sense of melancholy when a transaction closed and the management teams of the companies that we were advising would go off and pursue the ambitions and big dreams and create a lot of value for shareholders, and we were moving on to the next transaction. I felt like the train was leaving the station and I wasn't on it. And yeah, I just wanted to go and be part of building something that would have impact. And so, yeah, I moved from New York back to California, moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, and started really building my career in biotechnology.
Great. And so we talk about, or you just mentioned about building Checkerspot. So give us a bit of background to the business. You know, who are you? Where are you going? What do you do before we get into some of the sort of more of the technicalities?
Yeah, Checkerspot is a materials company. So we're innovating performance materials that have the added benefit of being more sustainable relative to some of the more commodity-based material inputs. And I'm speaking specifically to things like petroleum and the commodity-based vegetable oils like palm and soy. And biomanufacturing or biotechnology is the enabler because we have this capability to access really unique oils that have chemistries that have never been available at full commercial scale, but that we can access through the genes, the genetic code of plants that we then plug into a microbial expression system. And we're using microalgae as our microbial expression system that then can grow in fermenters and in a fermentation-based process to produce those oils at very large scale and at an attractive cost structure. And so we're really tapping into this white space of material science based on novel oils, or more specifically, novel chemistries of fatty acids that comprise those oils that unlock physical properties, performance properties that can be utilized in a range of applications from materials all the way through to functional ingredients and things like personal care and food.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I was going to ask you how you describe yourself, because when I look at similar companies to yours, sometimes for a novice like me, it's quite hard to put them under an umbrella, if you like. You know, it's material, ingredients, chemical, synbio, etc. But the material science seems to be the phrase that I come across most. Would that be fair?
That is fair, and that's definitely by design. For a few reasons. And that word design actually is really important because I feel pretty strongly that a lot of times when we think about creating value from a product development perspective, sometimes we over-index or overweight the technology and think about how a technology can find a solution in the market. And I think that there's a lot of value to apply design thinking, where instead of the technology finding a problem, it's identifying problems in the market and problems that consumers are facing or that industrial users are facing, and then working backwards to technology to solve that problem. And so for us, design thinking has been a pretty important feature in how we've thought about our commercial development activities. And you're right, the materials design is right at the forefront of that. Biotechnology is unlocking just extraordinary potential, even beyond the kinds of things that we're doing at Checkerspot. But the measure of the impact, the measure of what that means to consumers and to the day-to-day lives of people worldwide is really measured not in the technology itself, but what it does, how it impacts the products that we use, how it impacts the planet. And so for us, we're really focused on thinking about those value propositions, thinking about the use cases. And that really is at the nexus of those materials and ingredients, perhaps even ahead of the biotechnology, even though it's the biotechnology that's the enabler.
And people start talking about the tech. The tech isn't important. It's identifying the problem that you're trying to provide a solution for. That's what's important. The tech, whether it's a Zoom call or anything else, is the enabler to add value to somebody else's world, basically, in my opinion.
Yeah, and Paul, if I can jump in, I often use the example of a phone, and the phone is amazing, and my particular phone has like awesome engineering and like fantastic design, like aesthetically, it's super cool, but I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the semiconductors or like the data processing speed that goes into it. there are definitely people that do, and I am very grateful that they spend time thinking about those issues. But what I care about as the consumer is the functionality. It's the apps that are on my phone that really make it awesome. And this is, I think, a good analogy that kind of underscores the point you were making.
Yeah, yeah. And so onto that question I was going to ask you is, I guess, who are your customers? What are their problems, and how are you helping them overcome them?
Well, it depends on what the material is. And
Okay.
we've started with two urethanes and a textile finish that have performance features that all emanate, tie back to a base oil that is biomanufactured with microalgae. And we have entered into the market. Our point of entry into the market has been outdoor recreation. And you can see some skis behind me that exemplify that. The strategy that we're taking could best be compared to, say, back in the 70s or 80s, when a material like carbon fiber first came to market, and some of the oil majors that were innovating with carbon fiber thought about bringing those materials into the world in outdoor recreation, things like golf club shafts and tennis rackets and bicycle frames, on the path to scale, on the path to improve cost structure, on the path to larger markets like aerospace and automotive, which we now see carbon fiber used prolifically. It's the same basic approach. So we identified a place to enter into the market with urethanes, and specifically for our urethanes, we engineered them for strength to weight and damping properties, energy absorbing properties. And that's really important in the context of skiing, not only because of a more pleasurable experience out, especially backcountry skiing, but it translates to safety considerations when you get into use cases like ski mountaineering and ascending some really challenging terrain where there are hazards and where weight matters a lot, where the stability of the ski matters a lot when you're traveling through terrain and snow that has variable conditions. And so these are really significant physical properties that translate to a better experience and to safety. It just so happens that strength to weight and damping are also really important physical properties in the automotive industry for energy efficiency. And so we're really trying to, again, be mindful of what's the problem that the consumer or the user is facing. How can we make it better by utilizing a technology toolkit that can solve those problems, and then bringing them into the world in use cases where those physical properties are really valued.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. And again, when we talk a little bit later about the role of the consumer in that NPD process. But before we look at that, you mentioned the microalgae. So it would be really interesting to talk me through the process of the Checkerspot wing platform. So what are the key components and what does the process look like? I guess when you're going from the engineering of the microalgae to the application of the chemistry to the creation of the final biomaterial.
Yeah, we embarked on branding our platform and calling it the Wing platform, because by branding it, we put a name to it that then begs the question, how do you define it? Like, what does the Wing platform mean? And that's a really important question to answer and to illuminate. And the Wing platform sits on effectively four functional areas, the cornerstone of which is what we refer to as our molecular foundry. And this is where we're using microbes in a fermentation-based process to get to oils, as we were talking about earlier. And then second is chemistry or material science. So how do you utilize those oils with novel fatty acid chemistries to get to materials that are better than what's available? And we were talking about polyurethanes and textile finishes a few minutes ago. And that's where we started with some of our material outputs. And then third of the four is prototyping and fabrication. We have this model of rapidly iterating, designing, building, and testing with our fabrication and prototyping capability to utilize those materials and to build parts and products that exemplify, that test, that bring to life the physical properties that we were designing for. And then fourth and finally, we have a level of consumer engagement where we can deliver a finished product to consumers. And all along that continuum, which I think it's interesting to point out, mirrors the value chain, supply chains in a simpler way and in a much more concise and integrated way. It allows us to think about applying these design thinking principles, to think about innovating and being able to optimize performance properties very rapidly and in a super cost-effective way. And so let me give you an example with skis. We're able to engineer a urethane, a formulation of a urethane in about a day. And we can then build a ski in now about half a day. And then we can take that product and certainly test it in the laboratory. That's pretty straightforward. But taking it out into the real world can sometimes be a challenge. But we have our design lab based in Salt Lake City, which is at the foot of the Wasatch Mountains. So we can be, at least in the winter months, we can be out in the real world testing that product, gaining insight about how we can make it better. And then coming back to the platform to fine tune and optimize not just the chemistry and the formulation or the build or the design, but also the biology. And that's a tool set that is really unique when we look out at the world at consumer brands. Most consumer brands are, when they think about applications and prototyping, applications development and prototyping, are dependent on factories, often located in different parts of the world that sometimes don't have a lot of connective tissue with the brands to build designs, prototypes that sometimes to get delivery can be as short as a few weeks, but oftentimes can be a few months. And you may get a small number of samples that then maybe hit the mark or off the mark, but that process gets kicked out further and further if you haven't hit the mark. And it's just time intensive, it's capital intensive, it's carbon intensive, moving materials and products to different places in the world. And we've just identified a way to do this in a far more agile, more capital efficient, time efficient, and in a way that allows us to fail fast, to iterate rapidly, to get to better product formulations. And yeah, every project that we take on, either ourselves through our brand or with partners, and we've announced partnerships with DIC Corporation in Japan and with WL Gore here in the US and Beyond Surface Technologies in Switzerland, just to name a few, some consumer brands as well. We're able, like every time we do a project, the platform gets better and better. There's information and insights about how to optimize for performance that then benefits the next thing that we do.
Yeah, great. And it's interesting. One of the things you said there is a great thing for entrepreneurs, you know, that fail fast. You know, do you have a system around you which embraces failure, but not too much of it, but how you use those learnings back into the business growth or the MPD process, I suppose.
That's right. And we actually just had an experience with one of our partners where we had sent them a bunch of like formulations that we had developed, and they came back and in the conversation, it was a little bit sheepish where they're like, yeah, we didn't really hit the, you know, performance spec that we were hoping for in our testing for this, you know, one axis. And I was delighted. Like, that's great to hear. And what I voiced when we were absorbing this is like, I haven't experienced or seen anybody that in product development steps up to the plate and hits the first pitch out of the park. That just doesn't happen. But it's gaining the insights about, well, you know, what was off the mark, and then how quickly you're able to, you know, move forward with addressing that and optimizing. That's where I feel a lot of the magic happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I suppose you're not one of the things that needs a bit of clarification, I suppose, is if I'm correct, you're a material manufacturer selling to manufacturers of consumer goods, and then you sell consumer goods yourself. So how does that work together? And that must be a little bit not confusing, but it must bring some internal conflict sometimes to that, does it? And the role of that consumer.
It doesn't bring up conflict or confusion internally. And it's very clear to us because what we're doing from a consumer perspective is part of the Wing platform. Again, we've talked about our consumer engagement and our brand as being an extension of the laboratory. And so for us, it makes a lot of sense. But you're right that for third parties, for people outside of the company that are trying to understand what we're doing and how we're doing it, that can be a bit of a cognitive shift because, you look at the P&L, you're like, oh, there's revenue from consumer sales. Doesn't that define you as a consumer business? And we just see it differently. We see, again, that consumer engagement as being an extension of the laboratory. We get amazing insights. It gives us directionality in product development, and it changes the game. So what I mean by that is because of what we've succeeded in doing from an applications development perspective with skis and with other things that we're working on that we haven't yet announced, and to have the physicality and the data around those materials in use completely changes the conversation with third parties, customers, partners that we're looking to serve for their application sets. Because we've done it. And we're seeing things where we get access to others' labs and materials testing capabilities that creates this virtuous cycle of insight and learning around continuing to optimize for performance. And the conventional supply chain is so fragmented and disconnected that oftentimes there's too much siloing. There's too much of a disconnect between where the product is being sold and the product developers that created those products, and then where the materials are coming from or the factories where they're made. And yeah, we're just shifting that in, I think, a pretty considerable way that we are now seeing create value for us and by extension for our customers and partners. So to be really clear about what the business model for Checkerspot is, our core competency is the Wing platform. Our core competency is innovation. We don't have ambition to, all of a sudden be, a portfolio of, hundreds of consumer brands spending, hundreds of millions of dollars on marketing. We want to have more and more use cases, really exemplifying at the frontier of new materials development, materials and ingredients that we then can supply through sales or through licensing to third parties that can take those same materials, the same ingredients to their customer base, to their consumers.
Yeah. Okay. And so just as we start to sort of come towards the end of the interview, I suppose, a couple of questions left. You mentioned about I think you might have mentioned some new products or some new sectors. There's some stuff you can tell us, some stuff you can't tell us. But what's on the horizon for Checkerspot? What can we look forward to be excited and energized about?
I mean, there's, I'd say, two general buckets, which one is technology and product development. And we're working on some really interesting things that have novelty that the world hasn't seen that is enabled by biology. And then there's the commercial development piece. And, we've kind of touched on it. I've alluded to it. You I think, have picked up on it, that we're looking at things like SKU expansion for our brand Wonder Alpine. And we're looking at bringing to life other material formulations that really creates a lot of value for the alpinist. And I think when we look at our commercial pipeline and when we look at the inbound demand from industrial players and from other consumer brands, we're really excited about how we now grow into what we refer to as these adjacencies, like home and office furnishings and aerospace and automotive and building materials just to name a few, where the exact same materials, urethanes, textile finishes, are being utilized. And so you'll see us announce more partnerships in those areas. And then in addition to that, with the same base monomers that we've innovated, we have now done formulation work in things like personal care and food and nutrition, which I think surprises some folks. And yeah, we're going to be really clear in the coming months, both around partnership and how we're pursuing those, but also what exactly the formulations are and why they're interesting and valuable and why we're so excited about them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard that a few times actually from some of the material science or sort of biomaterial chemical companies that I've been talking to, in that there's an obvious sector, shall we say, let's say textiles as an example, there's an obvious sector. But then there are people who are talking about even space travel, automotive, all of these cool things that are, it's very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? You can roll it out across multiple sectors, which I think is pretty interesting.
It's very interesting. And it amazes me that, at least in my journey, in my experience, I never appreciated until probably the mid 2000s how petroleum gets into so many disparate products. And so when we think about the potential of biomanufacturing, it can be really easy to forget that this is pretty well trodden territory, how base monomers can have very seemingly diverse and varied application sets. But there's a rich history of how this has been done before.
Yeah. Listen, we have a couple of minutes maximum left, so I'm going to ask you one more question, okay? Which is a little bit left field, okay? But literally, we've got a few seconds. So, I was really interested to see some of the societal pledges on your website, which are a core part of your DNA, which I think is super cool and really into. What would you say to commercial businesses who think having a positive societal or environmental impact is a distraction from building shareholder value or profit?
Wow. I mean, there's so much that we can dive into on that topic, and I know we're running short on time. And so I'll try to distill it down to two ideas. And the first is that the framing of this conversation has been around performance versus sustainability. And we have this conviction that it's a false trade-off. And we're in the process early, but we're in the process of demonstrating how we can create performance materials that also just happen to have the added benefit of being more sustainable than the alternatives. But we're prioritizing performance, just illuminated societally that, yes, science matters, that climate change is real, that there are these existential threats. And when we look at the inbound demand from consumer brands driven by consumers, and when we look at the inbound demand from industrial players, the vast majority today are coming to us looking for alternatives to things like petroleum and commodity scale vegetable oils that don't have the best track record with environmental considerations. And when they find out that we can do things that actually perform better, where the economics are attractive, it's really amazing to see and to experience that aha moment that they have. And so we're really enthusiastic about bringing to life that concept. And the second point is, if we don't act societally, if we don't think about valuing and accounting for the externalities of how we build businesses and how we grow, then we're going to see negative economic repercussions. There's going to be tectonic shifts economically that ultimately will disadvantage us. And so we have to account for those. That's the fundamental two reasons. One, that performance versus sustainability is a false choice. And second, that when we think about not doing something, the economic cost is likely to be far greater.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely love the sentiment. And I don't know why I left the biggest question to last when we had a few minutes to go, but there you go.
It was hard to distill it down.
Yeah, that's really fantastic though. You listen, I could talk to you for another half an hour, 45 minutes, but we should probably wrap it up there. So listen, before we end this episode, just a little bit, if anybody out there would like to get involved in Biomarket Insights TV in any way at all, then please feel free to drop me a line at paul@biomarketinsights.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn. So Charles, listen, thanks ever so much for your time. I know that our audience of bioeconomy professionals and influencers and pioneers all over the world will be really interested in the insight and the vision and the details that you gave us today. So on behalf of myself and behalf of our community, thanks so much for your time, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, Paul. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.